It was the kind of silence that felt expensive. Polished floors, glass walls, and the hum of a boardroom projector looping its idle blue screen like a heartbeat skipped. Edward Langston, CEO of Hamilton Medical Systems, stood in the middle of his office, crumpling the fabric of his $1,000 suit with nervous hands, his eyes flicking toward the clock like it was a firing squad. The translator had called just 15 minutes ago. Car accident, minor injuries, impossible to make it in time. And now, with $75 million hanging in the air like mist over a cliff, the French delegation would arrive in 20 minutes, expecting simultaneous interpretation of every technical and ethical nuance in the proposal. "God damn it!" Edward's voice cracked across the corridor like a rifle shot, startling the assistant at the door and sending a ripple down the sterile hallway. "This is not happening. Not today!" Below, the elevator chimed open, and somewhere amidst the gleaming indifferent symmetry of the marble lobby, a janitor pushed his cart in quiet rhythm, his daughter walking beside him, her shoes worn at the soles, her backpack patched twice, her head tilted in the way of someone who listened carefully even when not invited to speak. She had just turned 13 last week, and as the panic thickened upstairs like smoke in an airtight room, the girl, Mea Carta, paused at the edge of the executive floor, glanced up at the chaos unfolding, and, with quiet clarity, said to her father in French, "Papa, tu as oublié tes clés à molette." A single sentence. And the world, for a moment, tilted. The offices of Hamilton Medical Systems rose like a cathedral of capitalism in Midtown Manhattan. 42 floors of chrome, glass, and ambition, where the sun refracted off mirrored panels as if even light had to pass inspection before entering. In this vertical world, hierarchy was not merely a matter of title, it was spatial, physical, almost architectural. On the top floor, Edward Langston reigned with the quiet severity of a man used to having doors opened before his fingers ever reached the handle. Born into comfort, educated in Boston, polished in boardrooms across Geneva and Dubai, he had built Hamilton's global reputation on precision, control, and the unspoken conviction that some people simply belonged more than others. Below him, on floor 2, where natural light rarely reached, and the carpets bore the burden of 1,000 forgotten footsteps, Marcus Carter mopped quietly with the rhythm of someone whose presence had long ago blurred into the background. For 21 years, he had cleaned the building without complaint, arriving before the executives stirred their coffee, leaving after they locked their briefcases. He had never once been late. His daughter Maya had begun accompanying him some afternoons since middle school let out early on Fridays. She never touched a mop but always carried a book, French novels mostly, and listened with the quiet attentiveness of someone who knew the world rarely gave second chances to girls who looked like her. Her eyes were the kind that watched everything, cautious, curious, already wiser than most adults twice her age. Jennifer Park, the CEO's assistant, had noticed Maya long before today. She remembered the first time the girl held the elevator door for her, speaking in near-perfect French to her father without realizing someone was listening. Jennifer, a second-generation Korean-American who had learned the price of invisibility in corporate spaces, had tucked that moment away like a page from a sacred book. Nobody on the upper floors knew Maya's name. They knew Marcus as the night custodian or the guy with the old cart that squeaks. They didn't know he once taught high school history before the district cut funding and his wife got sick. They didn't know his daughter read Camus in French and Baldwin in English. But they were about to. Edward Langston stood still when he heard the girl's French echo faintly through the corridor, a sentence so fluid, so natively accented, that for a brief moment he wondered if someone from the delegation had arrived early, but when he turned the corner all he saw was the janitor and a girl with tight braids, faded sneakers, and eyes that met his without hesitation. He blinked. "Who was that?" he asked Jennifer, who stood beside him, startled by the intensity in his voice. "That's Maya," she replied, uncertain. "Marcus Carter's daughter." Edward narrowed his eyes, as if squinting would make her less real. "She speaks French? Like that?" Jennifer hesitated. Yes, sir, fluently, self-taught mostly. Her grandmother spoke Creole and she— Edward cut her off. This is a billion-dollar company. I can't risk everything on a girl who probably learned French off YouTube. Behind them, Maya stepped closer, her voice steady, polite. I didn't learn from YouTube, sir. I learned from my grandmother, and then from books. And I speak standard Parisian French, not just Creole. There's a difference. Her tone wasn't defiant, it was precise, unbothered by the insult, as if she had heard it before in 1,000 other forms. Edward looked at her, really looked, and saw a child, 13 maybe. A custodian's daughter, too young, too black, too unexpected. Marcus stood frozen, a wrench still in his hand, as if unsure whether to apologize for his daughter's words or be proud of them. I'm sorry, Mr. Langston, he began, but Maya touched his arm gently. Papa, let me speak. She turned back to Edward. If the meeting fails, it's because no one here was prepared. Not because I'm too young, not because of my father's job, and certainly not because I'm black. There was a pause, thick, uncomfortable, the kind that makes men in suits shift in their shoes. Edward shook his head slightly, chuckled once. Dry, clipped. This isn't the time for idealism. This is business, serious business. Maya replied simply. So is understanding who's really qualified, sir. And for a moment the hierarchy faltered. Jennifer stood near the window, her tablet forgotten on the sill, her thoughts drifting somewhere between disbelief and recognition. The young girl's composure wasn't rehearsed. It was the kind born of necessity. The kind cultivated in spaces where brilliance is a private thing, held quietly until someone has no choice but to notice. Mr. Langston, she said finally, stepping closer, lowering her voice in the way women do when trying to speak truth into a room that rarely listens. I know, Maya. I've seen her grow up. This isn't a gamble, it's your only real shot. Edward turned to her, jaw tense. She's 13. Jennifer didn't flinch. And she reads French legal code for fun. He stared, uncertain if the line was a joke. She won the New York State Middle School debate tournament twice, Jennifer continued, her voice calm but edged with something almost maternal. She competed against high school students and beat them, every round. Topics ranged from immigration law to medical ethics. Her specialty is translating complexity into clarity. Marcus, who had remained silent throughout, shifted slightly, not in defense, but in quiet awe at hearing someone finally say aloud what he had long known. She doesn't just speak French, he said softly. She listens in it. Dad's different. Maya stepped forward again, her chin slightly lifted, not arrogantly, but as if bracing herself against yet another gust of doubt. I've read up on the Marcellin delegation, she said. Philippe Duvet lost his daughter 2 years ago to a diagnostic delay, the kind of delay your software claims it can eliminate. Edward's brow furrowed. How do you know that? Obituaries, Maya answered, and hospital reports, and one interview he gave last spring where he said he'd trade every cent of his company if it meant saving even one more child. Silence hung in the room, not heavy this time but thoughtful. Jennifer crossed her arms. She's not trying to impress you, she's prepared, more than any adult in this building. Edward looked at Maya, and for the first time the sharp edge in his stare softened. Not out of surrender, but out of something more difficult for men like him, the beginning of respect. Still, his voice held a thread of resistance. They'll ask complex technical questions. Maya nodded. I've memorized your past 3 product presentations. I corrected some of the French translations in your executive summaries. They're outdated. She handed him a sheet of paper, typed, annotated in red ink, precise. Jennifer glanced at it and smiled. Edward didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at Marcus, this quiet man who had waxed floors while raising a daughter who studied CEO obituaries for context. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he asked, Would you be comfortable stepping into the room, Maya? Her answer was calm, measured, clear. If you are. And so the tide began to turn. The room was cold, not from temperature, but from the weight of expectation. The way every pair of polished shoes and tailored cufflinks signaled years of calculated success and guarded power. Edward stood near the head of the conference table, his voice rehearsed, his palms damp, and his mind still unsure if the decision he'd made minutes ago to let Maya interpret was brilliance or absolute madness. When the doors opened and the French delegation entered, the air shifted. Philippe Duvet, CEO of Marcellin Biotech, was a man with eyes that missed nothing. His gaze scanned the room until it landed on Maya, standing beside Edward in a modest navy sweater, her hair neatly braided, a small notepad in her hand. His eyebrows lifted, not with offense, but with surprise. The kind that tilts the room slightly and makes people sit up straighter. Before Edward could speak, Maya stepped forward and, in flawless French, laced with subtle formal intonation, greeted the delegation. Monsieur, je vous souhaite la bienvenue chez Hamilton. J'espère que votre vol est agréable et que le décalage horaire n'est pas trop. There was a pause, not from confusion, but from the disbelief that a child could carry that much poise, and that her French textbook precise yet rhythmically alive had come not from elite academies in Lyon, but from an apartment in the Bronx, where books were passed hand to hand, like sacred objects. Philippe Duvet blinked slowly. "What is your name, ma petite?" he asked gently, in French. Maya did not hesitate. "Je m'appelle Maya, monsieur. Comme votre fille." At that, everything fell still. Philippe's lips parted, his breath caught, and in that fragile moment of recognition, one name echoing another, one girl replacing a ghost, something broke behind his eyes. His daughter, May, had died at 12 from a preventable condition. Her name had not been spoken aloud in any boardroom since. Until now. Edward watched, stunned, as Duvet sat, nodded, and gestured for the meeting to begin without another word. For the next 45 minutes, Maya translated every detail with the elegance of someone born to occupy spaces she'd never been invited into. She adjusted tone when emotions rose, softened technical jargon without losing precision, and paused when Duvet's hands trembled, letting silence do what words could not. When a slide about diagnostic AI appeared, Duvet asked sharply, "Will your technology actually prevent the delays that cost children their lives?" Maya paused, looked at Edward, then answered not just with translation but interpretation. "Monsieur Duvet asks not only whether our system is efficient, but whether it can prevent the grief of fathers who buried daughters too soon." It wasn't just business anymore. It was mourning, memory, and a young girl turning pain into possibility with a clarity no adult could have offered. And in that moment, Maya Carter didn't just translate a deal, she resurrected a vision of what medicine and humanity could be. After the final handshake, after the signatures had dried on the paper that would change the course of Hamilton Medical Systems forever, Edward turned to Maya with something in his eyes she had not seen before. Unease, but also reverence. The way people look at stained glass for the first time after years of walking past the same church. He reached into his jacket, retrieved a pen that gleamed with gold trim, and said with practiced charm, "Maya, you've just saved this company. I'd like to offer you something. Whatever you want. A check, a trust fund, just name it." Maya looked at him, not with suspicion, but with the gentleness of someone who understood that power often came wrapped in guilt. "I don't need a check," she said softly, her hands folded neatly in front of her like a scholar at a lectern. "But I'd like to ask for something." Edward raised his eyebrows, unsure what request might come. "I want a scholarship fund," she said, "for kids like me, kids who speak different languages at home, who help their parents clean buildings after school, who get overlooked until someone's desperate." Her words did not sting, they settled. They landed like pebbles in a still pond, rippling outward in slow, undeniable truth. Edward hesitated. "You don't want anything for yourself?" Maya tilted her head, thoughtful. "Mr. Langston, I've already gained more than I ever thought possible today." But the difference between a miracle and a movement is whether we let it end with one person. Behind her, Marcus stood quietly, hands clasped, eyes shimmering, not with pride alone, but with something deeper, the peace of knowing that dignity passed down in silence could bloom into strength in the open. And Edward, for the first time in a long while, simply nodded. Not as a CEO, but as a man learning to see. Weeks later, a small bronze plaque was installed in the main lobby of Hamilton Medical Systems, just below the company's mission statement, where executives and interns alike passed each morning without looking up. It read in simple serif letters, "Brilliance lives in unexpected places, if only we learn to look." In honor of Maya Carter. There was no unveiling ceremony, no photographers, no press release. Just a quiet Friday morning, a still hallway, and Maya, walking beside her father with her backpack slung casually over one shoulder, her eyes glancing at the inscription but not lingering. "Papa," she said softly, "I have French club after school today, but I'll be home in time to help with the church lesson." Marcus smiled, the way only fathers who have seen their children rise while the world looked away can smile. Like light coming through a crack in a thick wall. As they reached the elevator, Edward stepped out of it, briefcase in hand, suit impeccable. For a brief moment, the three stood in an odd triangle: executive, janitor, child. Each a witness to the kind of day that rewrites memory. He nodded at Marcus, then turned to Maya. "Thank you," he said simply. Maya just smiled. Because the real victories, the ones that echo longer than applause, are the ones that don't need to be spoken. That evening, long after the building had emptied and the silence of the 41st floor returned like a humbled ghost, Edward Langston stood alone in his office, the skyline glittering behind him like a curtain he no longer trusted to hide what mattered most. He held a glass of untouched scotch, not for comfort, but for the ritual of reflection. For 20 years he had passed Marcus Carter in the hallway without once asking his name. He remembered the countless mornings he'd nodded vaguely while sipping espresso, the perfunctory greetings that sounded more like echoes of politeness than acknowledgement of another human being. And he thought of all the missed chances, the invisible moments when genius passed by in silence, wearing old shoes and carrying a library book wrapped in a grocery bag. How many Mayas had walked his halls? How many had gone unnoticed because their brilliance wasn't clad in prep school blazers or framed by Ivy League legacies? The question haunted him, not because he feared the answer, but because he now understood the cost of never asking. He poured the scotch down the sink. And in that small act, quiet, unceremonious, unseen, something within him shifted. Not redemption, not yet, but the beginning of humility. The kind that teaches a man not just to listen but to see. By the end of that fiscal quarter, Hamilton Medical Systems had become more than a company. It had become a case study. Maya Carter's quiet brilliance and the story of a boardroom saved not by capital or credentials, but by a janitor's daughter, had reached places neither spreadsheets nor marketing campaigns ever could. News outlets called it the Maya effect. Universities invited her to speak, not because of her age, but because of her insight. CEOs sent letters not to Edward, but to Maya herself, asking how they too could find the unseen prodigies walking their corridors in silence. At a technology summit in Seattle, her short talk on listening as leadership drew a standing ovation before she had even finished. Yet Maya never moved out of the Bronx. Each evening, after interviews and emails and new doors opening too fast to count, she returned to the same apartment with the peeling linoleum, helped her father sort the laundry, and practiced new languages with the neighbors she now tutored. When asked by a New York Times reporter why she hadn't transferred to a private school with her new scholarship offers, she smiled and said simply, "Because the kids I want to help are still here." And in that sentence, in its grace, its steadiness, its refusal to be lifted out of the world she was trying to lift, she reminded the country that genius isn't defined by escape, but by how deeply one chooses to stay. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, with the city hushed under the soft hush of late spring rain, Maya sat on the church steps with a notebook in her lap, her handwriting small and deliberate. She wasn't solving equations or preparing for a panel. She was drafting a proposal for a community program to teach children in her neighborhood how to write resumes in 2 languages. Beside her, Marcus sipped his coffee, eyes on the street, where pigeons danced in puddles and dreams still wore cheap sneakers. Edward arrived without an entourage. No tie, no suit, just a weathered notepad and a look that had lost some of its sharp edges. He sat quietly beside Maya, as if asking permission simply by his presence. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about what you said the first day, about the difference between a miracle and a movement." Maya looked up, her expression unreadable, then softened. "Movements take more than one person," she replied. "They need people willing to see differently." He nodded. "I want to help." She handed him a printed sheet, her blueprint for the educational fund she'd dreamed of since she was 9. "Then let's begin." And just like that, in a moment without headlines or cameras or applause, a second wave began, gentle but sure, not in a boardroom but on a church stoop, between a girl with borrowed brilliance and a man finally learning how to pay attention. Because real change always starts small, just large enough to be noticed by those who have learned, at last, how to see.